Well, welcome back, Quest Juniors. It's good to see you again. So, last time that we met, we had just preserved the Union. Abraham Lincoln's dogged perseverance under fire was able to keep the United States together. The Union was victorious, although Lincoln didn't live very long after the end of the war to deal with the aftermath here. So he kind of becomes this martyred figure, almost the perfect president, elected to a second term, never would serve longer than about 35 days. And his vice president, Andrew Johnson, would be left to sort of clean up the mess and deal with the aftermath, which I will say may very well prove to be an even harder challenge than winning the war. I mean, winning the Civil War was largely a military exercise rather than a political one. There are some politics involved with certain decisions, but Reconstruction, the war is over. You have to basically govern, and this country has always been kind of unwieldy. It's sort of difficult to govern and get your end results immediately that you want. Reconstruction's largely a forgotten chapter in American history. It's sort of recently been rediscovered in the last 20 years or so. Why was it forgotten for so long? Well, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of wounds there. There's sort of Southern pride, humiliated that they lost the Civil War. And there's sort of a Northern humiliation that they gave up on Reconstruction. And so sort of you get this mythology about it that it was either a very corrupt period or a period of anger and revenge, a very divisive period, and that's all you really hear about it. You don't hear about the tremendous progress that was made, the valiant efforts that were made by wonderful politicians in the Republican Party. And what a valiant effort it was. And had we done everything right then, we might not still be suffering such horrible racial wounds in the year 2020 if we had just gotten it all right in the 1860s and 70s. So this is a wonderful cartoon here by the great cartoonist Thomas Nast. And it depicts in a nutshell basically what Reconstruction is. And now I'm realizing you guys can't see it because I didn't share my screen yet. Luckily, I caught that at the beginning. So this is the political cartoon. What it depicts is the Union soldier. It's no one in particular, just the Union soldier. You know, he's flanked by the American flag here. On the left-hand side, you see these sort of ex-Confederates very angry at how their life's been turned upside down. And then you have this new class of people here, the former slaves. They will be referred to as the Freedmen. Even women and children that were former slaves are all just collectively called the Freedmen. And it is the job of this Union soldier to basically keep the factions apart and to move forward with the progress of America. So it's best to kind of reflect for a moment on just where exactly we were in April of 1865. It is, in a lot of ways, one of the lowest moments in American history. The South, although they lost, they put up one heck of a fight. And in so doing, much of the South infrastructure was destroyed. Now, they didn't have much of an infrastructure as it were. It was really just one big cotton plantation. But to the extent that there are cities and infrastructure, they look like this. This picture, when I first saw it, I assumed it was Stalingrad or Dresden or Hiroshima from World War II, and it's not. This is Richmond, Virginia in 1865. It had been laid siege for several months, surrounded, cut off, and shelled. And this is an American city, and it was just totally destroyed. Atlanta, Georgia, largely burned and destroyed by Sherman's troops in the fall of 1864. New Orleans is largely left undisturbed, but to the extent that there are big cities in the South, they look like this. Harbors, factories, any kind of transportation, railway lines that exist, they're all blown up, destroyed to hamper the end of the war. General Sherman had this sort of new, very modern attitude that in certain types of war, like total war, where the entire population is mobilized its economy to fight a war, there's very little distinction between civilian and between combatants. So Sherman had the idea that as we go through the South, we're going to burn people's homes. We're going to confiscate property. We're going to free slaves. We're going to kill animals. We are going to live off the fat of the land. So when General Sherman's marching with some 60,000 troops in 1964 all through the South, they were unsupplied. There were no Union supply lines, from the North feeding them anything. They just sort of like a swarm of locusts descended upon the South, ate everything in sight, requisitioned what they wanted, burned anything of value they weren't taking with them, and just left total destruction in their wake. It's very much similar to the bombing campaigns of World War II and afterwards, that you put pain and pressure on the civilian population to end the war more rapidly. Sherman coined this phrase, war is hell, which a lot of people have noted and criticized is probably not the most accurate understanding of it. But Sherman, the rest of the quote is not usually mentioned, which is war is hell, and there's no sense in making it nice. That the sooner or the more cruel you make it, the sooner it will end and the sooner the cruelty will end. So in a way, perhaps he was a humanitarian in that sense, trying to make war, painful in the short term, but shorter in the long term, so to speak. At any rate, this is what the South looks like. Many people's homes were destroyed. Transportation lines, telegraph lines, all of that is obliterated. It lays in ruin. The South was near starvation at this particular time. It just so happened that the war ended right at the beginning of planting season, the first week of April, 1865. This is an agricultural society. Still, about 3/4 of Americans live on farms. They need to get home and they need to start planting right away. Particularly Southerners, but Northerners as well. These soldiers need to get home or there will be a mass famine in the United States. Robert E. Lee comes out to his troops April 9th, 1865, says, boys, you fought a good fight, but it's time to go home. And several of them say, General Lee, my home's in Arkansas, 1,500 miles away. We're in Virginia. How do I get home? And there was no answer to that. This Southern government, the Confederate state government, had misled their people, led them into disaster, and now had no solution for them. They were totally reliant on Northern forces to be nice to them, and they were terrified there would be some great purge. And this is, again, where I will say that Americans are not well understood by history, by those who study it. We have this reputation that we're particularly cruel and savage and violent. We are to the extent that we're human beings, and human beings are pretty awful towards each other. But if you actually look at us in our darkest moments, the Revolution and the Civil War, when literally we're at war with ourselves, we actually treated the losers pretty nicely. If you study the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, in civil wars and revolution, the side that wins is usually unbelievably cruel to the side that loses. Usually you just have mass executions. At the final surrender, you just round up all of the lead officers, thousands of them usually, and you just dig a big mass grave, often have the soldiers do it themselves, and they're just mowed down by machine gun bullets, summarily executed in the thousands and just thrown in a big pit. In France, they invented the guillotine and killed tens of thousands of people that way, publicly. During our revolution, we just told the Tories, you can't stay. You're going to have to go to Canada. And that was it. Property was seized, but there was no mass executions or anything like that at all. No purge, no bloodletting, nothing like that. Same thing in the Civil War. Southerners, ever since 1865, have sort of created this myth that Reconstruction was this sort of punishment and revenge. If it was a revenge, it was the nicest revenge I've ever read about in my life. The North nurtured, took care of, and tried to move the South forward. And the South, like a spoiled toddler, was sort of throwing a tantrum during the whole time of Reconstruction and ended up ruining the whole process. But nonetheless, the Yankees started first issuing food rations. There were over 1 million rations distributed to civilians that first year of the war. Some of it was to the freedmen, the former slaves. Some of it was to Confederate soldiers. Some of it was just to poor white Confederates who lost their homes and had no capability to feed themselves. But over 1 million rations. This is sort of in an early industrial society, which is rather amazing. And equally important was getting all these people home. As I said, it was critical to get everybody home by planting season. And North had to rebuild the railway system of the South to get everybody home, right? That soldier I just mentioned that has to go all the way home to Arkansas. He's not going to walk home barefoot. He's going to probably spend a month or two in some sort of refugee camp that the North set up, that their army just set up, took people's names, telegraphed their families and their hometowns, and then got them home. They did actually a rather wonderful job. Now, the devastation is just unspeakable. If you look at the population of the South, now the South lost fewer soldiers than the North, but they had a smaller population to begin with. At the end of the Civil War, about 7% of the general population of the South lays dead, which is just an astonishing statistic. That's just about as bloody as wars get. I mean, if you look at the Soviets during World War II, they probably lost 15 to 17% of their population, which is unspeakably awful. But let's take another one, or what's considered to be a pretty big-sized war, is the Israeli War for Independence, 1947 to 49. It's estimated that about 1% of Israel's population perished in their War of Independence. And this was 7 times worse than that. It was catastrophic for the South. The North, it wasn't quite as bad. It's about 2-3%, but still, that's a pretty devastating war. 700,000 people killed in 4 years out of a population of about 31 million. That's pretty atrocious. Even more than that, even more than the actual literal devastation and destruction, was emancipation itself, which, you know, you don't need to feel bad or apologize for that. Emancipation was a wonderful thing, but understand, when you have an economic system where all of your wealth is tied up in slave labor and you own that slave, that is your source of capital, right? That would be the equivalent to a northern factory. It's what actually produces things, okay? So when I say in capital, I don't mean investment capital. What I mean is capital is an economic term that means anything that's used to take raw materials to make a finished product. Usually it's a machine of some kind. And in this case, slaves were the capital of the South. Without slave labor, nothing got done. It was the backbone of the entire Southern economy. And now the slaves were freed and they owned their own labor. So what of the landowner? Well, they still own their land, but they have no capital. They have no machinery like the North invested in, and they now have no slave property because emancipation had taken it from them. And this was a terrible blow to the Southern economy. About 40% of the South's capital assets were just snuffed out in an instant. And this was true of all slavery societies in the Western Hemisphere. When you look at their production of cash crops before and after slavery, there's no doubt about it. It just drops off of a cliff. Slaves were worked very hard and they produced a lot. Now, when they're emancipated, nobody works as hard from their own motivation as they would when they're forced to by, the lash. And so cotton production plummets and the South economy plummets. Estimates show that the Northern economy recovers about 14 years after the end of the war. And by 1879, there is no trace whatsoever. All the economic indices are on the same trajectory they would have been had there been no war. 14 years, okay, which is a while, but compared to what it was for the South, it ended up being 44 years. Not until 1909, well into the 20th century, William Howard Taft was president right after Teddy Roosevelt, when the South finally regained its trajectory. And still to this day, the South lags behind the North. There's a couple of pockets of the South that are very productive. Texas is a very wealthy state. You find cities like Atlanta. Virginia is practically a northern state at this point, both politically, culturally, and economically. But the rest of the South still lags quite a bit. One of the poorest states in the Union, Mississippi, still struggles quite a bit to catch up with just other states in that region. So this was a devastating experience for pretty much everybody in America. And it is now the job of Andrew Johnson to deal with this mess. And the man was just not up to the task. Andrew Johnson, the little tailor, they called him, he was not a slave owner. He had sort of like, don't get him confused with Andrew Jackson. I know it's easy because Andrew Johnson, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Johnson, also from Tennessee, also sort of a rags to riches story, but he was not a plantation owner. And in fact, he hated this class of people. he was sort of a populist in that he thought the best people were landless whites or yeoman farmers, white in the South, and that the planter class had really abused and misled this population. And Johnson really wanted revenge on that class of people. Now, don't get it misconstrued here. He's no friend of the freedmen. In fact, he's probably the most racist president we ever had, even more so than the slave-owning presidents we had. But he's a unionist, and he wants to punish the South for putting everybody through this terrible experience. Now, it just so happens that the war ended right as Congress was going to recess, and they would not come back until December. So from basically May to December, mid-April to December, Johnson is sworn in as president, and he's got to figure out exactly how to do all this. And what he basically says is, I have these tremendous war powers. I command an army that's in the hundreds of thousands, and the army's going to handle most of these tasks. So they're going to distribute rations. They're going to, get people back home. They're going to take an accounting of everything. They're going to interrogate all of these Confederate leaders and say, hey, we're going to treat you guys well. So please order all the people of the South to just go along with this. So there's no, guerrilla warfare that envelops the country forever. And with respect to those things, Johnson does a pretty good job. Now, there were numerous questions that nobody could really wrap their heads around. Number one, what exactly was the political status of these Confederate states? So they had seceded, they had created their own country, and now they had lost this rebellion. Do you just immediately give them their senators and representatives back without sort of a purging of disloyalty? I mean, this was a civil war after all, and the leaders of these southern states had led the rebellion against this country. Is there going to be any punishment for them? Do we have to get rid of a certain class of people? Maybe not kill, but just exclude them from office? Because this Constitution gives a tremendous authority to the states. And if those states are taken over by bad people, they might lead us on another rebellion, or at least the sacrifice won't be worth it. So there's lots of questions about that. Is how do you reintegrate the South politically into the system? Lots of questions. Can we just sort of boss them around and tell them what to do by gunpoint? And for how long if we do that? I mean, it's understandable we're going to have to do that in the immediate aftermath, for a month or two, but is this going to go on for a decade, just bossing them around? If you guys have read the books, The Hunger Games, this is where Suzanne Collins kind of got this idea from. I remember seeing the first one many years ago. I only saw the first one. My wife read the book. She wanted to watch it, and so I tried to ruin it for her as best I could. And I said, oh, this is just an allegory for Reconstruction, right? I remember watching it in the beginning, and I said, gosh, where does Katniss live? It looks like a really awful place. And I remember joking, it looks like West Virginia or Mississippi, these really impoverished areas. And they've lost some sort of war. And I've asked, my wife the plot. I'm like, well, how long ago was this war, and what was it about? I said, oh, okay. President Snow is Lincoln. He's won this victorious battle. And, Katniss, I forget what district she lives in, but that's the section of the country that was bad. That was Mississippi or Alabama that seceded, right? South Carolina, whatever you want to say. So you're going to have to immediately tell the South what to do and use force. But, are you going to do that like the Hunger Games 100 years later, or whatever it is, 75 years later? Are you still going to kidnap their teenagers and make redneck teenagers fight until the end of time on television for our entertainment? It does sound a little fun to have, Zeke and Cletus kind of wail on each other for our entertainment, but that's uncivilized, and we're American. We're not going to do that. So how do you do this? A country that prides itself on not centralized authority now has to centralize authority to rebuild these southern states. Nobody knew exactly legally how we were going to achieve this. In some ways, it might just be a might makes right kind of thing. Let's just do it and figure it out later. Another equally thorny problem would be, what's the status of the freedmen? We have no laws saying, establishing what citizenship would be. Amazingly, there were very few laws that talked about federal citizenship up to this time. Almost everybody thought citizenship in terms of what state they were from. Like, I'm a citizen of Virginia or Connecticut. People didn't really think I'm an American citizen. People didn't hold passports in the 19th century. They didn't, sort of get that representation of federal citizenship Federal citizenship just allowed you to file suit in federal court and use of the ports of entry into this country, which almost nobody ever did. Very few people traveled abroad at this time. And so it's a bit of a weird question. We have to have the federal government come down and say, this is what federal citizenship means. And we're going to have to amend the Constitution to do that. Johnson was just not up to this task very much at all. Pondering all of this stuff, he said, all right, well, problem number one is there has to be some kind of punishment for what the South did. Now, this was an enormous rebellion with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who took a direct part. We don't have the stomach for an immense bloodletting of killing over 1 million people. There were whispers about really crazy kind of plans. Right after the war, Johnson and his Secretary of State, William Seward, are in negotiations with the Russians to buy Alaska. And some people are saying Alaska can be like our Australia, where we'll just round up all of the really bad Confederates and just ship them up to Alaska and say, hey, you know, go live in the wilderness, make this wonderful paradise here into some kind of place you want to live. We did not do that. We didn't have the stomach to do that. And so we're going to have to sit down and really get this right. So Johnson says, here's what I'm going to do. If you are above a certain rank, and I forget exactly what it was, I think colonel or major or something like that, then you are going to have some kind of trial to determine your guilt for treason. Likewise, if you have a certain amount of wealth, then that meant that you donated money to the South, donated by loaning it in the form of buying bonds, and that you paid a huge tax revenue to kind of support this government. Or if you had a certain political rank, any politician, if you were mayor, city council member, governor, senator, president, vice president, then you were going to have some kind of trial and you could apply for a pardon. Everyone under that rank and under that wealth was just blanket pardon, like you're forgiven, right? Just because you were a Confederate soldier, we don't blame you. You were drafted, you had no choice about this. We're not going to punish some poor yeoman farmer. But the wealthy, the powerful, the high up in the military, they are going to have some kind of punishment. Now, everyone below that got a blanket pardon. Everybody above that just had to apply in person for a pardon. They had to buy a railway ticket, they had to go to Washington, D.C., and they had to wait in this long snaking line through the streets of D.C. leading to the White House. They had to come and meet Andrew Johnson in person. They had to fall to their knees and beg for forgiveness, and he pardoned every single one of them. This is about all he does from May through August of 1865, is just meet one-on-one with these people. And he really wanted them to grovel, right? Johnson has this inferiority complex. I was that poor white trash kid in school all those years ago. Now I'm the president of all of y'all, and you are going to fall to your feet and beg for my mercy in front of me. And so he does this one after another. He just pardons them. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, when Sherman's, tearing through the South, most of the wealthy class of Southerners, they escaped through the blockade and they fled. Some of them went to Mexico. They just dropped everything and just, hid out in Mexico because they were certain they were going to be killed for treason. Some of them escape with their slaves and they make it down to Brazil, some of them Cuba, but a lot of them to Brazil, and where slavery still exists, and they bring their slaves with them and try to start over there. And so there was sort of a vacuum of leadership. There was nobody in charge in the South. After these pardons, those people are going to come back. This created tremendous confusion because the Union Army, while it was picking up the pieces, kind of went from plantation to plantation. It said, who's your former master? Where is he? Oh, he fled the country. All right, you have 2,000, acres of land here, and there's, X number of slaves. So we're just going to divide up all the land, and you just sort of tend it so that there's no famine, no starvation. You get the land yourself. And they sort of just scribble on a little piece of paper, like, there's your deed to the land. I'm chopping it up here. About 6-7 months later, after Johnson pardons all these people, the landowning class comes back, and there's this problem of the courts of sorting out all this, confusion over who actually owns the land, the freedmen or their masters, right? And so that's going to take several months, if not years, to work out in court. Turns out the old white masters are going to get all their land back, basically. Almost none of it that was distributed there in mid-1865 stays with the African-American landowners who it was given to. At any rate, Johnson is basically done with this process by December of 1865. What he basically said as far as political reintegration is he said the South needs to just restore itself. He doesn't even use the term reconstruction. He says restoration, just put it back the way it was, restore it. And he just sort of says, white people, white men of the South just sort of get together and rewrite your state constitutions. Those state constitutions have to repudiate secession and slavery. You have to say, slavery was wrong and we're never going to do it again. And no one's going to get any money, any compensation for it. You have to say you're sorry for seceding from the Union and, treason. And you have to basically say that you'll never do it again. That's it. If you do that, you get your senators and reps back. Every one of these 11 ex-Confederate states did that minimal amount. They had rewritten their state constitutions, and they basically reapplied for admission to the Union. They held elections, and in January of 1866, it becomes very apparent this is not going to work. Problem number one is that ex-Confederate leaders get elected to office. That class all comes back to America when they realize the North's going to be actually pretty nice and there's not going to be any mass executions. By the way, no one was executed for treason. Some people will whine and cry about, Mary Surratt, and she was the woman that owned the boarding house that Booth and his, conspirators stayed at. There was a bit of evidence that she knew what was going on, but she's not killed or executed for treason. Jefferson Davis, the man that led the rebellion, is put under house arrest for 2 years, and then he's just sent home. He writes his autobiography, a 1,000-page autobiography of his life. He regains his fortune. He outlives everybody from the war, Lincoln, Grant, Sherman, everybody, and suffers very little. I mean, this is amazing. If you led a rebellion against your country and you were told just 2 years of house arrest, not even in jail, just in house arrest, very little punishment. Now, Jefferson Davis, is not going to be able to run for re-election, but his vice president did. Alexander H. Stephens, vice president of the Confederacy, actually gets elected to be senator from Georgia, shows up in 1866 and says, gosh, I've missed you guys. What's been going on? And Northerners just were not having it. Everybody in the North had multiple relatives who had died in the Civil War. And they just said, look, we don't have the stomach to execute every person in the South that was involved in this, but you're not going to take your spot back in the federal government. That right is eliminated to you. You're not going to be able to do that. So the Congress, as it was, just refused to seat all these new Southern politicians. Along with that, these state governments could have done anything they wanted with respect to Black freedom. They could have said, you're full equal citizens. They could have turned the reins over to them and said, you're in charge now. We had, control here for 200 years. Now you have it. Certainly didn't do those two things. What they decided to do is do what every other country did that eliminated slavery. Once there was no slavery, they said, aha, but there's not full equality between everyone, right? Under the law, we're going to have levels of citizenship or tiers of citizenship. A lot of countries do it this way. Even today, America makes no distinction between whether you're a naturalized citizen or a citizen that's born with birthright citizenship. It's the same thing. The only difference is if you naturalize as a citizen, you can't be president. Other than that, you have full equality under the law. Not under the set of laws called the Black Codes. The Black Codes were started in the South after the Civil War, and it's even worse than the Jim Crow system that would emerge in the 1890s in the South. It was a system of segregation and oppression. It resembled slavery in just about every way you could. It's just you couldn't buy or sell a person, and you couldn't force them to work on your land. But Black citizenship was given no rights, not the right to vote, not the right to sue in court, not anything, just the right to property and to work. That's all, the only right you had. And so Northerners just said, no, this ain't going to work. We are denying you readmittance to the Union until we figure this out. So 1866 is this period of sort of tug of war where the Congress starts to reassert itself against the new president. After all, Congress didn't like or trust Andrew Johnson. He's president by accident. Lincoln should be the president. I mean, supreme irony that now a Southerner is leading Reconstruction. But life is full of those ironies sometimes. So going forward, Congress will reassert itself and be very much at odds with the new president. Johnson would break a record for vetoes. He would veto more legislation than Andrew Jackson, but he also holds the records for most vetoes overridden. I think I mentioned before that the Democratic Party was a shell of its former self, because when secession happened, like half the Democratic Party left. So their numbers that were remaining in the Congress were very small. The Republican Party controlled 2/3 to 3/4 of the seats during the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so they could just do whatever they wanted to do. They would pass a law, Johnson would veto it, and they would just pass it over his veto. It takes a 2/3 vote to do that, and they just kept doing it. The first instance of this was what was known as the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This is what CRA stands for there. The Congress basically felt, okay, we are going to have to use federal law to override all these awful black codes that the southern states have written. And that's what the Civil Rights Act did. It formally said, under the law, black citizenship and white citizenship are equal. There shall be no discrimination. Now, did that mean the right to vote? Technically, no, because nobody's voting on anything in the South, because they can't vote for federal office yet. They can vote for local stuff. That was all to be kind of sorted out. But the Civil Rights Act would overturn the black codes and try to give equality on the job and under the law politically to African Americans. Johnson vetoed this, basically saying that the black race did not deserve all these rights and that the white race was superior, etc. He vetoed it. They just passed it over his veto, and we have our first Civil Rights Act ever. Second is the Freedmen's Bureau, which I haven't talked about yet, but this was sort of a humanitarian association created by the federal government in the last few months of the war, and then it continued on for several years afterwards. It was known as the Bureau of Freedmen, Abandoned Lands, and, oh, forgive me, I'm forgetting what the other thing was. It had this long, convoluted name, but in any case, basically what it was, like I said, this humanitarian agency that was dealing with freedom, right? Like you'd come to a plantation, and the army would, the Northern Army would, and they would say, all right, your master's left, you know, here's your deed. And then they would try to help people out as much as they could. They'd say, all right, let's give you some equipment so you can, farming equipment, so you can, you know, be more productive. Let's set up a school in the local community to teach everybody to read and write. Let's, like, you know, let's try to build the South in the North's image, right? It'll be just like some Yankee, Connecticut town. We'll just build it here in Mississippi. And there'll be black and white people living together, prospering. That's basically what the Freedmen's Bureau was. It was about aiding not only the freedmen, but, you know, poor whites as well in this newfound freedom. Remember, the South was a society that did not have public education before the war. Women didn't work outside the home. It was not like the North in that way. And you got to kind of teach them, quote unquote, Yankee ways. Johnson, of course, vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau and said this is basically welfare for poor black people. And he felt whites in the South never had that. When I was a poor white kid in the 1830s, nobody gave us welfare or handouts. We had to just earn everything by the sweat of our brow, which I would retort, you did have welfare. The US government stole a continent from the indigenous people and gave it to poor whites, and that was your welfare, as you owned land stolen from the original inhabitants. So don't get on your high horse about how you never had any help. In any case, Johnson vetoed both. Congress just passed it over his veto. And so this is basically a declaration of political war. The Congress saying, we do not trust you, we do not like you, you're unfit, and we're just going to govern and do whatever the hell we want to do. Now, they had the votes to override legislation, but our Constitution gives other powers to the president. After all, he's the commander-in-chief. He commands the army, and the army is where most of the instrumentation for Reconstruction was. Although the army is going to be demobilized pretty rapidly after the war, that's another thing about this war, is most large civil wars or revolutions, the army sort of never demobilizes and bosses people around and we become, you know, or the society becomes a police state. We never did that. The army demobilized pretty rapidly. Most people went home. There's a small contingent of Northern soldiers in the South kind of, you know, controlling things. But largely the South was just sort of told, you know, you just got to make sure you do this, do that, and just, you know, govern yourselves, so to speak. And there'll be like, you know, a Union detachment and regiment that will show up when things get really out of control, a big riot or something like that. And so this created confusion. Johnson in charge of the army, Congress in charge of the laws, and we don't seem to have a policy. Southerners just sort of would read the newspapers and say, so what exactly are the policies? Do the black codes still exist, or did the Civil Rights Act, you know, wipe those out? There were lawsuits, cases going through the courts. All of this stuff was trying to be sorted out. There was all kinds of questions about stuff. But Nobody had any answers yet. That would all be sorted out in the years to come. And there are two huge race riots, or I would rather call it massacres, that occur in 1866. Because Black participation and freedom was so prevalent, it created consternation from whites in the South, meaning Black men showed up at constitutional conventions. They exercised their right to vote. It was rather extraordinary that in South Carolina, for instance, which was more slave than free, the majority of people that show up at their constitutional convention had been slaves just a few months before, and now they were taking part in this grand experiment in democracy. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. Well, white Southerners thought it was the end of humanity. They would not sit down with Black legislators, and this tension would spill over into the streets where you would have out and out massacres. Now, a massacre is different than a race riot. A race riot's when populations of two different races will start a sort of, small fight that escalates into citizens on both sides harming each other and harming each other's property. A massacre is when the government does it. And that's what happened here, is that quite often the sheriff, the white sheriff of these southern towns, would form posses, deputies, police, etc. Almost all of them had been former Confederate soldiers and had military training, and they would just go through Black neighborhoods doing unspeakable kind of actions and crimes. Now, when these reports hit northern newspapers, in each case, the Union Army is dispatched and they, stop all the killing, but people are just disgusted by this when they hear that Black women were raped in their own homes, that their homes were burned down, that people were just bayoneted in the streets. They looked at the death tolls and they just said, the South has learned nothing from this experience. We are going to have to tell them what to do, because clearly playing nice and just saying rebuild your societies is not working. So Congress does a couple of things. Number one, they pass a new constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment. Now, I hadn't really mentioned the 13th. This is passed in January of 1865 under Lincoln. It's going to formally end slavery everywhere. And I think I talked about this last time, that slavery was sort of ended in chunks, like the Emancipation Proclamation freed about 85–90% of the slaves, and then Missouri and Maryland would vote to end it within their borders, and then the 13th Amendment would just wipe it out everywhere in the US. That's passed by, ratified by December of 1865, and slavery is completely obliterated. But then we had this question of citizenship. So the 14th Amendment would handle a lot of these issues. What it really did was that it made the Civil Rights Act of 1866 permanent. There's a big fear that the Republican Party had is, well, the Democratic Party will retake control at some point, maybe not in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years, but at some point they're going to take control. And it's just a simple majority vote to repeal this law. And this law is wonderful. It grants citizenship to African Americans. And so they decided to pass a constitutional amendment that would make it permanent. Now, I will tell you, because I majored in American constitutional law, not all amendments to the Constitution are created equal. Some of them are much more powerful, I would say. And the 14th Amendment is, to me, the sort of engine of the Constitution. Remember that as it was written, the Bill of Rights in 1791 only applied to the federal government. Things that say, like, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, that only applied to the US Congress. It didn't apply to state governments. State governments could oppress you all they wanted. After all, slavery was a legal code system made by the states. And you had no protection from that kind of stuff. No protection of equality. States could just treat people differently. And so this amendment would be the first one ever that the federal government was empowered to restrain states from being terrible. That was just unthinkable. Now, federal government could restrain states that were just violating the Constitution, like, hey, you can't coin money, things like that. You can't tax the national bank. But you could not go to the federal government if your state government was sort of kicking you around and oppressing you. There was no rights that were protected by that route. Now there was. You could go to federal court and sue your state, and a federal judge would tell your state, stop it. And if your state didn't stop it, that judge could order that the president send the army in to actually protect your rights. And this is what we do now. This is the society we live under now. Unthinkable prior to 1868, when this amendment was finally ratified. It was incredible. It was amazing. There's lots of other stuff in there too. This repudiated the Confederate debt, meaning a lot of Southerners felt, well, my slaves were taken from me and I had bought $20,000 in Confederate bonds. Can Mississippi pay me back for that debt? Now, understand what you did. You loaned the state of Mississippi or the Confederate government money. They used that money to kill Northern soldiers and launch a rebellion. The North basically said, no, you ain't getting that money back. That's also what the 14th Amendment says. It disfranchises Confederates from office. It basically says if you served in the Confederate Army or government in any way, you can't serve in public office anymore. And several states went further in the South, and they just flat out said, you can't vote if you served in the Confederate Army or government at all. And it explicitly would enfranchise freedmen, meaning that, well, I'll get to that on the next slide, okay? I'm getting a little ahead of myself there. No, the 14th Amendment, wonderful thing, right? Of course, Johnson was against it. He urged Southerners not to ratify it because this is very weird how this was done. Northerners basically said, okay, how does this, become ratified? Do we just have because you need 3/4 of the states to ratify a proposed amendment, right? So is that 3/4 of the states remaining in the Union or 3/4 of the ones that were always in the Union? Can the South ratify these amendments? And they were made to, meaning that basically the federal government dangled the 14th Amendment over the South and said, you must ratify this as a precondition for getting back into the Union. Sort of a humiliation, right? I imagine sort of some sort of fraternity initiation ritual, right? Like you dangle the smelly socks over their faces and you're like, okay, you have to walk with these on your face for 100 yards or do push-ups with these wrapped around your eyes or whatever. We're going to hold this 14th Amendment over you that's all about racial equality, and you, white former slave owners, have to say, yes, we agree in black equality. And once you say those words and agree to it under the law, then we will readmit you to the Union. Johnson went and told Southerners, don't ratify this. This is unconstitutional, which I don't understand how an amendment to the Constitution could be unconstitutional. In my opinion, it is the completion of the Constitution. Sort of the Constitution was not entirely finished in 1787 or in 1791, even when the Bill of Rights was passed. It allowed slavery. It allowed states to oppress you. This would give full equality and liberty to all citizens. It was a wonderful thing. Johnson could not stop it from being ratified. He tried as much as he could, but it would be passed anyway. Then he went on a rampage and fired 1,644 postmasters. But you would say, why on earth would he do that? This is because Reconstruction was implemented through about 3 agencies. Number one, the federal court. So if you were a freedman, an African-American person, former slave living in Mississippi, and your rights were violated, you could go to about 3 agencies. If you were lucky enough, you could go to the Union Army and tell them, this branch of the KKK is terrorizing me and my family, and they're threatening to kill me if I vote. Please come and help. You could go to the Freedmen's Association that was building schools and doing things like hiring lawyers for people. Now that there was no slavery, you had to become a sharecropper. And that was a system that slaves had no understanding of. And freedmen had to be educated about what is this, right? What is a percent? Because now you're not a slave, you are free, and you have to sit down and negotiate a contract. How do you know what 50% of the crop yield is? Lawyers were given free of charge through the Freedmen's Association, and they would negotiate these contracts on behalf of the freedmen. And then you could tell them hey, my rights are being violated in this, that way, other way too. Lastly, you could go to the postmaster. If you weren't lucky enough to have the freedmen or the army in your local community, what does every town in America have? A post office. And one thing that the Republican Party tried to do was appoint Black postmasters all throughout the South. It was the one job where it was okay, we could hire an African-American person for this job. And Southerners hated. They thought that this was just the worst thing ever. They referred to it, forgive me, as Negro Rule, right? Basically meaning that white Southerners could not determine their own lives. They had no agency, that Blacks were in control of them now, and that was illegitimate, terrible, unnatural, an abomination, etc. That Blacks were now in charge of the lives of white people, which was not true at all, but they imagined it to be. And so they hated this. And Johnson fired all the postmasters so that they wouldn't listen to the complaints of Black residents. Well, The Republicans sweep the November elections of 1866. They have even larger margins when they come into office in 1867. They control over 3/4 of the House and Senate because Johnson was so unpopular. And Congress decides, we're just going to overrule everything that Johnson did, and we're just going to tell him what to do because the people have spoken loud and clear. So the first thing that Congress would do is pass one of the most extraordinary laws in American history, the Military Reconstruction Acts. There's 4 of them, and they passed them through the spring and summer of 1867. And here's basically what it would do. Number 1, this would divide the South into 5 military districts. The 11 ex-Confederate states would be put under martial law, essentially, except Tennessee. Tennessee had actually already reconstructed itself because it was the first state invaded, and it was sort of reconstructed all through the war, and they had done everything that was wanted of them. They ratified not only the 13th, but the 14th Amendment. They had purged ex-Confederates. They protected the Black right to vote. And so the Congress just said, okay, Tennessee, you're back in the Union. You get your senators and representatives back. All you other Confederate states, you're going to be put through a very painful reconstruction process where we're in charge of you. So number 1, these states would be divided into 5 military districts, regardless of state boundary or state sovereignty. Like there was no North or South Carolina, it was just District 2, Military District 2. And a Union general was put in charge of Military District 2. Virginia would be coterminous with District 1, but it wasn't called Virginia, it was Military District 1. Florida, Alabama, and Georgia were District 3. Mississippi and Arkansas would be District 4, and Texas and Louisiana would be District 5. And a Union general was just put in charge and just said, we are the lords of this area. Now, one could be of 2 minds of this, is that this is rather heavy-handed. This is in America where Union troops are just the law and we're bossing people around. This is not very democratic. However, others would say this was the best way to protect the rights of African Americans, that if you just let, the South kind of try to figure everything out, the power structure would still be a white power structure and they would not protect the rights of African Americans. So, this was a destructive war. Perhaps they need a little military occupation until things are settled. In any case, it was a very shocking thing, and Southerners just could not believe that their rights were just going out the window and they were going to be an occupied people. But that's the way it was. A lot of talk, and Southerners still, a lot of them think this way, that they were sort of victims of this terrible oppression, almost similar to how Boston and Massachusetts were treated on the eve of the Revolution, right? That General Gage just came in and wiped out freedoms and told everybody what to do. I would say a little different, right? This was a huge rebellion against their country. Massachusetts was put under martial law before any kind of rebellion took place. It was just a little mischief from the Sons of Liberty. But in any case, this was very draconian and strict, but I think it was warranted. Second, put under martial law, the provisional authority would be temporary, and it would be inferior, meaning that there was sort of state and local governments, and they could kind of do their own thing. But if the military governor came in and just sort of said, no, we override this rule, it was overridden, basically. The military was to go out into Black neighborhoods and knock on doors and register Black people to vote and to take part in a reconstruction. Because remember that all of these states had sort of written new constitutions in 1865. Those were now ripped up, shredded, and thrown out the window. The Black codes were a dead letter under the law, and they had to reconstruct with Black participation. Because in 1865, sort of the white power structure didn't let African Americans participate. And so now you had Black participation. And Union soldiers would stand out in front of these convention halls and check IDs, and they had a list of all people that were in the Confederate Army, and they said, you can't participate, you can't, but if you were a former slave, you can. And so in most of these southern states, there's not only Black participation, but Black dominance in terms of numbers, like in South Carolina. A very weird paradox happens, which is that South Carolina goes from the most regressive, slave society to one of the most progressive. South Carolina's constitution is amazing because former slaves wrote it, and it was incredibly progressive. and it would remain under Republican control until 1877 because African Americans were the majority. Now, Johnson could not overturn this law. He vetoed the Military Reconstruction Act. It was passed over his veto, and the law was just going to go forward. And so what he started to do was just fire a lot of these generals, right? General Sickles over in District 5 out in Texas is a little too aggressive at registering Black citizens to vote, so I'm going to fire him. And I'm going to put a very corrupt general in charge, and a lazy one, and a racist one who won't do anything. And so Congress decided they had enough of Johnson, and they finally said, we are going to impeach him. Now, you guys probably remember, President Trump was impeached about a year ago. I can't believe that I've actually old enough. I've lived through 2 impeachments. My parents have lived through 3. Technically, Nixon wasn't impeached, but it was very close to becoming that way. 3 presidents have been impeached in our history. None have been convicted. And one, Richard Nixon, was sort of quasi-impeached. He was investigated. They were talking about impeachment, and he just quit before he was actually impeached to just save everybody the trouble because he was guilty as sin, and they had him on tape doing all kinds of bad stuff. Now, with respect to Clinton and Trump, we'll just talk about this real quick. Bill Clinton, if you guys don't know, had and has a very bad reputation for being a womanizer, and he definitely was. He's been accused of a lot worse than that, and it's unclear if he's done kind of the really bad stuff, the sexual assault stuff. There's accusations, but we're unclear on that point. But what we do know is that basically Clinton was being investigated all through 94, 95, 96, 97 for things that never really panned out. There were accusations that he was taking bribes, that he was laundering money, that he was doing all this stuff as governor of Arkansas and as a private citizen. All of it was proven to be false. There was no evidence of any of that, but the guy was a womanizer. And so he got in trouble for that, basically, is that after the investigations were launched, he was having an affair with this younger intern, very young intern. She was 19. I think he was, how old was Clinton at that point? Probably 50 or 51. And he was asked about it by the special counsel. They kind of got wind that he was having this affair. They put him under oath because he was being sued for sexual harassment. And they asked him this unrelated question: have you ever had relations with Monica Lewinsky? And he said no. And they were able to eventually prove that, in fact, he had. And that's perjury. You can't lie under oath. Now, the question was, is that really an abuse of power? Like, it's a bit, and I get this, it's a bit different if you're put under oath and they said, hey, did you actually steal that money as president and put it in your pocket, and then lie about it, and you lie about it, then that's to me a bit worse than, hey, are you having an affair? Which it's like, okay, that's not good, but is that actually abusing the authority of the presidency of the United States? He's lying to protect his reputation and to protect his marriage, etc. And so most of the American people forgave him and said, look, it was sleazy, but and even illegal, but not every lie under oath is quite the same, right? What if they asked a president if he was an alcoholic, and he was, and he lied about it? You shouldn't even be asking that question to begin with. Let the person have some privacy. And what does that have to do with abusing authority over citizens? So Clinton was not convicted. Most people just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, the guy is sleazy, I'll give you that, but is he an out and out criminal that's threatening, the Constitution? No. Trump and Nixon are a little different. Nixon, we could go on for days about all the stuff he did, but essentially his underlings were running the scheme where they were basically committing all kinds of crimes, breaking into offices of Democratic people, wiretapping them. Not the FBI, but the president's private security team was doing this. His reelection team, basically. They got caught, and Nixon did everything he could to cover it up using his power of office. So he was going, they were investigating, he was going to be impeached within a week, and the Republican Party turned on him because it was all taped, and he just resigned. In Trump's case, you guys probably remember, those of you that watch the news, essentially Trump was, this is very delicate because, he is the president now, and I want to be as neutral as I can on this point and stay out of trouble. His motivations for doing it, I don't know. I could surmise, I could probably guess. But what we do know is that he withheld aid to the Ukraine. Ukraine is an ally of ours, and it's at war with Russia. And so Congress had appropriated all this money, you know, to spend on anti-tank missiles and all kinds of stuff like that. And he withheld that unless the president of Ukraine would announce that they would investigate Joe Biden and his son. Now, both sides kind of have their arguments here. Republicans argue that the president can investigate whoever he wants. That's his job. He should be able to do that. Democrats were very, very clearly upset by this, arguing that he was using his power basically to rig an election, because Joe Biden did beat him and is the president now. He was the front runner in late 2015. It was clear that in the polls, Biden might beat Trump. He would have a better chance than Bernie or Elizabeth Warren or the others. And so the Democrats argued that that was effectively rigging an election, that Biden and his son had done nothing wrong in the Ukraine. It gets very technical about what was done before. And that if you are going to investigate him, it's a process. You know, the attorney general does that, but you don't shake down other governments and deny them American military aid to announce this to rig an election. Were Trump's motivations honest, or were they, you know, was he just trying to do the right thing and investigate crimes, or was he shaking down another country to rig an election and jail his political opponent? Really, your opinion of Trump sort of guides you in what direction that is. In any case, he was impeached by the House and he was acquitted by the Senate. Mitt Romney was the only Republican that voted to convict him. But this is what impeachment is. It's sort of this thing that's handed down to us from the British. You could not, impeachment is very weird in the British system. The analogy would be the king from our president. You can't impeach the king or convict the king. You can impeach his ministers, though. And you can do that in the American system, too. In the American system, Congress can impeach and convict anyone in the cabinet, vice president, president, anybody. It's a very weird power. It's never actually worked in our history, meaning that we've had several presidents impeached. Impeach basically means indict. It doesn't mean kick out of office. It means we're going to have a trial. The trial goes to the Senate, and every instance of this, all 3 times, the president was acquitted. Now, in Nixon's case, he would have been convicted. But in the other 3 cases, you couldn't get to the threshold because it takes 2/3 of the Senate. Now, if ever you were going to have a president kicked out of office, here it was. I mean, after all, like I said, you don't even need any Democrats to cross the aisle and vote. If you just get every Republican to vote to convict Johnson, he's dead. He survived this. There were a handful of Republican senators that switched their vote and they voted to acquit Johnson, and he survives it. Now, quick question. What did he do to actually warrant impeachment? It shouldn't be just the president's unpopular, right? There's different theories of impeachment. Some people feel like if your president's a disaster, even though they're not committing any crimes and they're just totally incompetent, you should be able to impeach them just for that and convict them. Others believe, no, you have to actually be performing as a tyrant and violating the Constitution and abusing your power in office. And that's always something that's a bit nebulous. Are they really doing this, or could you excuse it? Johnson hadn't violated any laws. He was just being a jerk. There's nothing that says you can't veto or fire people. One thing you might say about him, as bad, as terrible as a human being as he was no liar. He was an honest person, and he hadn't violated the law. And so a handful of Republicans crossed the aisle, voted to acquit him. And by a single vote, he was acquitted 35-19. Now, Johnson was shaken up by this. He basically went home to Tennessee and didn't do anything the last year that he was in office. He was sort of a pariah. Southerners hated him because he didn't join the Confederacy and he sucked up to the Union during the war. That was their perception. Northerners didn't trust him. In fact, a lot of Northerners start these conspiracy theories that Johnson probably had Lincoln killed so that he could be president. There's zero evidence of that. So in some ways, I feel sorry for him, but he was a pretty awful president. Had he done things right, America could have turned out much for the better, and he did not. Instead, the Republicans look forward to Ulysses Grant becoming president. This used to be a big American tradition. We would have a big war, and then the victorious general would become our president. After the Revolution, we get Washington. After the War of 1812, we get Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison. After the Mexican War, we get Zachary Taylor. And after the Civil War, we get Ulysses Grant, right? The great hero of the Union Army, man who actually beat Robert E. Lee. Now, Grant has a very simple slogan in 1868. He had a 4-word slogan, "Let us have peace." What that meant was anybody's guess, but he basically felt that enough conflict had gone on. One thing I hadn't talked about was there was this new organization known as the KKK, and they had killed some 2,000 freedmen in Louisiana in 1865 alone. That there was this terrorist group that was out and about just murdering people in cold blood, and the Union Army just couldn't get it under control. That, all the yelling, arguing, bickering, confusion, he just wanted it to end and move forward. Most Northerners voted for Grant thinking, this is the guy to do it. If he beat Robert E. Lee, he's going to whip the South into shape, and this would be the time to do it. Now there won't be any more obstruction. There would be Republican president, Republican Congress. Everyone would be clicking on all cylinders. Grant would send in the army and just get it done. And so Grant comes to office in early 1869. It honestly seems like Reconstruction might be almost over and done with. We have a 14th Amendment. The Military Reconstruction Acts were going forward and working for the most part. About 6 of these states had already reconstructed. The only ones that hadn't were Virginia, Georgia, Texas, and Mississippi. They had not yet ratified the 14th Amendment and written these new state constitutions, but they would very rapidly. So is Reconstruction possibly done, or should it be done? Most people felt, no, we still have a lot more to do. And a big problem were, as I said, these people right here, the KKK. This was an organization founded in 1866, just after the Civil War, and largely it was a terrorist group, a very effective one, homegrown, and it was, most of them, you had the military training, they were ex-Confederate soldiers, and they felt, okay, secession was bad, and that's not something we should have done, but what the North is doing now by trying to give equality between the races is an abomination, it's unnatural, it is oppression. And they viewed themselves as freedom fighters, that basically they were an occupied people. They hated the Yankee troops being, there telling them what to do, and they hated that Black people now had rights and were voting and serving in office, and they just were enraged in it. So Grant decided he had had enough of this. And so in May 1870, the Enforcement Acts were passed. This is also known as the Klan Act or the KKK Act. What the Enforcement Act did was it allowed the president to declare martial law, suspend habeas corpus, and send in the army to Reconstructing states. These were states that had already gotten their senators and representatives back, and they were independent. Still, the Union Army would be stationed in the South, and the president could just declare an area under martial law. Just say the Klan is so out of control in this county in North Carolina, we're sending in the army, suspending habeas corpus. That means we're just arresting thousands of people and not telling them why and just throwing them in jail for weeks on end. And I love this part. We're going to arrest these Klan leaders and we're going to give them a federal trial. The problem that the federal government always had with the Klan is you could often catch Klan members, but you couldn't get convictions because you would, all of their crimes, murder, assault, robbery, rape, mutilation, all the awful things they did were all state offenses. They had committed no federal crime. So the sheriff might catch them and put them on trial, and then all white jury would acquit them because they'd sympathize with them. They might have family members on the Klan. And so this Enforcement Act made it all federal crimes to intimidate someone from exercising their right to vote. So if you burn a cross on someone's lawn and you threaten to kill them if they vote, that's violating their federal civil rights. Now the Department of Justice will send the army and federal marshals after you, and you will be whisked away to Washington, D.C., a city that is 60% African American, and you will get your trial from an all-Black jury. This is sort of an inversion of the Jim Crow system that you guys are probably familiar with. And for instance, you read To Kill a Mockingbird. Tom Robinson does not get a fair trial by jury. He lives in an Alabama town where at least half the population's Black, but the jury's all white, doesn't sympathize with him, and convicts him even though it's clear that Mayella Ewell lied about him, right? If you guys remember the story, great book. Now, I love the Enforcement Act, and I think it completely redeems Grant. If you guys aren't aware of this, Grant is often put kind of at the bottom of our president's list, and he's been reevaluated in the last couple of years because when he left office, most people thought he was corrupt, he was terrible, and some of that is true, and we'll get to the corruption later. But he broke the back of the KKK. completely. They just dried up in just a year and a half. By 1872 November, the Klan basically had been devastated, crushed all over the South through this law, which is a very good thing. 1872 was the most peaceful election during all of Reconstruction. Black men came out and voted. Sorry, Black women are not going to get the right to vote because no woman had the right to vote yet. One state did, Wyoming, and my joke is both women that live there enjoyed the right to vote. Wyoming's a super small state, right? So a few white women in Wyoming could vote. Other than that, nobody could. But Black men voted, and they elected these wonderful Republican governments in the South that did wonderful things. The Democratic Party is so out of it, so disorganized, so defeated that they do not even run someone against Grant. They just feel like, who's going to stand in front of Ulysses Grant and get destroyed? That's crazy. This is the only time in history that I can think of that this happened, other than when the Federalist Party imploded and basically just handed Monroe the presidency twice. They don't even run someone against Grant. Instead, a new party forms called the Liberal Republicans, and Horace Greeley, a newspaper editor from New York, runs against Grant, talking about good, clean government and no corruption, and he gets devastated. Grant just mops the floor with him. It was a good time to be Republican in 1872. And so Grant moves forward with this. Now, these Republican governments did wonderful things. Southerners have not stopped whining and complaining about Reconstruction like it was this awful, terrible period. Already the KKK's back was broken. That's a wonderful thing. Here's what these Republican governments did. First, who was a Republican, who was a Democrat during this time? In the South, there was basically a tripod. The Republican Party stood on three legs. The biggest, strongest, and most important one is the Freedmen. That's probably about 60 to 70% of the Republican Party, depending on the state that you were in. And it was understood that if you just protected Black people's right to vote, they would be Republicans. This might seem weird to you today, because today about 90% of African Americans are in the Democratic Party. That's because the terms liberal and conservative don't change their meanings, but parties can change what they stand for. The Republican Party was the liberal or progressive party of the 19th century. The Democrats were the conservatives. It's now the opposite of that, okay? Now, the second group were what were called Scalawags. Now, a scalawag, what it literally means is a horse that's the runt of the litter. It's kind of this useless animal on your farm that you don't need and don't want. And it just sort of sucks up resources and doesn't do anything for you. And so that term was applied to white Southern Republicans. These people were typically Whigs before the Civil War. They had warned everybody that the Civil War would be a huge disaster. Most of them were like, they weren't big plantation owners. They were lawyers, or they might have been army officers, or they were newspaper men. And they just said, y'all are crazy. The Yankees are going to just destroy us. So don't secede and don't do all this. And when the war was over, that class of people sort of shook their finger and said, told you so, right? And they just sort of welcomed the Yankees in and said, hey, you know, let me show you around the place. Let me show you how to govern. And they were sort of viewed as collaborators, right? Like when the French went into Vietnam, some Vietnamese said, oh, put me in control, boss, and I'll rat out all my, you know, Vietnamese brothers and sisters. That's how they were viewed. I don't view them that way. I view them as very pragmatic, practical, good people, but they were considered race traitors and all the rest of it, right? The last group were called carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers were Northerners, both Black and white, who came down to the South after the war. So, for instance, there's a lot of examples of these people. My favorite is a gentleman by the name of Marshal Twitchell. He was a Union officer from Vermont. When the war ended, he was stationed in Mississippi. He had never seen a palm tree in his life. And he was so taken by the climate. He just said, wow, you know, like in Vermont in the wintertime, you can't even bury the dead because the ground just freezes solid. In the South, the winters are very mild. It never snows here. And in this community, I could be the mayor because I actually have some money. I can take my wealth and buy a big plot of land here. I can, you know, build maybe a sawmill here because my father ran one in Vermont. I can show them Yankee ways of capitalism. Now, of course, these were wonderful, nice people that were putting their lives on the line. I almost imagine them as sort of missionaries or Peace Corps members, like people who want to go to a depressed, violent, chaotic, lawless place and bring about equality, justice, law, order, etc. That's what they were doing. They were viewed, though, as sort of foreign occupiers, that they weren't Southerners, that they were illegally seizing control, and they were sort of propping up black voters to immorally keep them in office, which I don't view it that way at all, but that's how it was viewed, that they were there to loot the wealth of the South, which my retort would be, what wealth? Everything was destroyed. After all, these people, most of them came down in 1865 when Johnson's, restoration governments were still in control, when black people couldn't vote, and when white Southern power was at its height. And they desperately needed investment capital. They needed Northerners to come down and open up businesses so that people could have jobs and the rest of it. And so they were not treated very well. The Klan would go out and they'd try to kick these legs out from the stool. They'd terrorize freedmen, carpetbaggers, scalawags to try to break up this tripod. And at first they failed. Grant had the ringleaders arrested, tried. Many of them went to prison for long sentences. And these governments did wonderful things in the South. They built the first public school system. Southerners did not believe in that before the Civil War. Yankees in Massachusetts and other places in the North, like Ohio, did. And so the first public schools are open. Women now have rights, not the right to vote, but the right to go out and work, just like Yankee women had in the 18-teens going into Lowell Mills. Southern women did not leave the home, not for any kind of career or anything. Now, if you were unmarried, you could. Railroads. The North spent a fortune rebuilding the infrastructure of the South. Isn't this awful? Isn't it terrible? Like I said, these are basically the best governments the South ever had. And Southerners have just never stopped crying about this ever since. It was corruption. It was terrible. It was mismanaged. It was theft. Really what they were angry about is point 4, is that there were black men who now got elected. There were black mayors, black city council members, black senators, black congressmen, no black governors. Every Southern state still had a white governor. But this was incredible. These were men who were just slaves a couple of years ago, and now they were in some cases running, or at least taking part in, the government of the South. And that's really what set off a lot of white people. They were viciously racist. And it didn't matter that these governments were giving them tangible, wonderful things like teaching their kids to read and write. Just the thought that a black person was now their equal under the law just infuriated them. And most white Southerners did not like these governments and in fact supported the Klan. In Grant's second term, we start to get a lot of problems. First, you had corruption. I don't have time to get into all the various, corrupt scandals, but you had 4 of them. You had the gold market, you had the whiskey ring, you had the Belknap scandal, you had Credit Mobilier. They're all very interesting, but basically, these were all scandals, not Grant's fault, and he's not involved with it, but Grant, and I get this because I've been in a minor position of power. I was department chair for 5 years in the history department at Millikan, but it was my job to hire people, to be on interview committees and hire them. And it's a tough thing. In 15 minutes, you have to get a sense of who someone is for a lifetime, because once you basically hire a teacher after their 3rd year, they have tenure and it's impossible to fire them. And if you make a bad mistake, you're stuck with it for a long time. Some people are very good at this and they can spot, someone's character in a couple of minutes. Some people are really bad at it. Grant was terrible at it. He trusted all the wrong people. He surrounded himself with people that just were looting the treasury, betraying him, etc. He was squeaky clean and honest, but everyone in his administration was having their hand in the till, basically stealing. And one by one, they got caught, and it just rubbed off on Grant. And the Democrats, ironically, could point at the Republicans and say, those guys are corrupt, when in fact, the Democrats were even worse at the time. The most corrupt politician ever in American history was a guy by the name of William Marcy Tweed. He was a politician in New York City. He ran Tammany Hall, and it's estimated he stole $15 million in the 1860s and 70s. That's a lot of money. We're talking about billions of dollars. Basically, he would raise taxes and borrow money to build courthouses and infrastructure in New York, and then he would commit fraud to steal money, right? He would find some sort of construction company and he would say, hey, how much is it to build this courthouse? $100,000. All right, let's write down on paper that it's 200,000. I will give you 100,000 and I'll pocket the other 100,000, right? You just inflate the numbers and I won't quite pay you what the records say. That was a Democrat. So they, in fact, were even worse than the Republicans, but the scandals and the headlines were always at the federal level and the Republicans controlled the federal government. And so these scandals just hurt them really bad. Finally, in Grant's second term, Reconstruction will just totally unravel. After 1874, it just sputters out. Problem number one is that the Democrats recontrolled the House in 1874. That there was a huge switch, and after that, it's basically all over. You're not going to get any new Reconstruction legislation, and you're going to be stymied to try to start anything new. Eventually, you'd have a disputed presidential election in 1876. We're not quite there yet, but here's why that will happen. Now, number one, Klan violence. Now, the Klan was snuffed out in 1871-72, but after 1873, they start to reemerge, or at least copycat groups that are very similar. And the Supreme Court made it easy for them. The Supreme Court struck down in the U.S. versus Cruikshank and U.S. versus Reese cases. The Supreme Court, a Republican Supreme Court, invalidated the Enforcement Act, said it was unconstitutional. It gave too much authority to the feds, and it usurped from the states the right to prosecute violent crimes. And so that very powerful tool was just taken out of Grant's hands. And so now when you got word that there was this violent massacre, the KKK went into a black church and massacred 50 people to intimidate them from not to vote, you try to arrest them and put them on trial, and the courts would throw it out and say, this is not the job of the feds, go to the states. Well, you go to the states and it's an all-white jury and they don't do anything. So next. So, you know, with the violence, you get lower Republican turnout because they were scared, and Democrats start to take control and they start to unwind Reconstruction. Second, the political corruption. All these scandals gave the impression that the Republicans were stealing money from American citizens, and that Reconstruction was all this big hoax. Where did all this money go that was supposed to be rebuilding the South? Well, it was being stolen, a lot of it, and the Republicans were stealing it. Third, there was an economic downturn. We overinvested in railroads. Because of corruption, the US government was building a lot of railroads where we didn't need them, right? Because every time you built a railroad, you could steal out of the treasury and, you know, give it to your buddies. So we built too many railroads. We were oversaturated. They were competing against each other in a cutthroat way, and there wasn't enough freight or passengers to move along these. Railroad companies went belly up. They couldn't repay their banks, and there was a huge recession in the mid-1870s, worst one we've ever had. And whom did everyone blame? The Republican Party, because they're in power. You get the credit, but you get the blame too. So one by one, these southern states are quote unquote redeemed. Redemption is always in quotes because it's not really redemption. What it means is Southerners have said this, and up to this day, some of them still believe it, that after the Civil War, they were punished by this illegitimate occupation, and that this was the liberation of the South, that eventually the Democratic Party retook control. It's hard to see this map, but if you can blow it up a little bit, the black number in the front represents when that state re-entered the Union, when, you know, they were let back into the Union with their representatives and senators. And all of them were let back in with, you know, political control under the Republican Party. The red number to the right of it represents when restoration, or well, not restoration, but redemption happened, when the Democratic Party wrestled control back. Wasn't that long if you look at it, right? If you look here, Texas, 1869, back in the Union, 1873, the Democrats retook control, right? The last states where it unraveled was Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, 1876. Florida too. So Reconstruction eventually would unravel because even Northerners saw the Republican Party as corrupt, as stealing, as incompetent in running the economy, and they just sort of got Reconstruction fatigue, like a lot of us have Afghanistan fatigue. The Afghanistan war is older than you guys are. Most of you probably don't even know why we're there. And if you guys were told we're leaving, we're coming home, probably most of you were like, I didn't even know we were in Afghanistan. Who cares? Leave that place, right? We can't stay there forever. Most people had the attitude, even in the North, they just felt not that the South, you know, was being oppressed or anything, but they just said, I'm over this. I'm done with it. And so by 1876, the country was very divided, held a presidential election, and this one goes down in history as the most corrupt election we ever had. There's been a lot of accusations that the most recent election was stolen. There's no evidence that happened at all. We've had some other fishy elections. I remember 2000, that one was kind of crazy. This is when, you know, George W. Bush and Al Gore were both competing over Florida. 500 votes would determine the presidency there. They were doing recounts, and it was shut down by a Supreme Court that Bush's own father had appointed 2 of the members to it, along with Ronald Reagan and several other Republicans. And a 5-4 Republican majority ended the recount and gave Bush the election. It seemed a little fishy to a lot of people. 72 was basically stolen as well, 1972. We'll talk about that later. This one, though, was pretty corrupt on both sides. Now, number one, basically what happened is the Klan came out and they were vicious, nasty, and violent on Election Day. No one knows for sure, but probably thousands of people were murdered on Election Day in America. This is the kind of stuff that happens in the developing world today, and it shocks us. When, in South Africa, white racist mobs will drive by black neighborhoods and gun down people waiting to vote to intimidate them so they don't elect, politicians that black South Africans might like. Same thing happened in America. This kind of terrorism and intimidation occurred all throughout the South on Election Day. When the votes are being counted, it seems very fishy. These 3 southern states, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, did not make sense to most people because those states were either 50% or greater African American. And if you just had an honest election, the Republicans should have won. And there were some counties that were 99% black in Louisiana, where 112% of the vote went for the Democrats, which made no sense to people. Now, what happened was a lot of the people counting the votes were in the KKK or the Democratic Party, and they just threw out the ballots afterwards or intimidated black voters. And it seemed very fishy. These states, kind of local people on the ground level were saying, hey, the Democrats won, but the governors and the state legislatures were often Republicans and just said, well, we're just going to kind of throw out certain votes and overturn this. Sending 2 separate slates of electors to the Electoral College, counted in front of Congress, and Congress just couldn't figure out who these 3 states voted for. And so we had a huge crisis. This crisis would go on and on and on through November, December, January, February. There were threats on both sides. The Democrats said, if this election is overturned and Rutherford Hayes, governor of Ohio, wins this, we are going to secede again and there'll be another even worse civil war. Republicans basically said, go ahead and do it and we'll beat you again. The Democrats were actually throwing their support behind New York Governor Samuel Tilden, who Republicans hated him because he was a draft dodger. He got drafted during the Civil War, paid a substitute, and bragged about how he never served in the war. The Civil War was an awful war, et cetera, et cetera. This is just a decade or so after the Civil War. The wounds are still fresh, and Northerners view him as a complete traitor, and it looked like he might have won this election. He got more of the popular vote, but it looked like, on paper anyway, he might have the electoral votes. Congress formed a commission to investigate. They would have no authority to decide it, but they would investigate. There were 5 members from the House, 5 members from the Senate, 5 members from the Supreme Court. The 5 members of the House, you had 2 Republicans, 3 Democrats. From the Senate, it was 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and then you had 5 people on the Supreme Court who were supposed to be nonpartisan, but really it's 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats. And on a straight party line vote of 8-7, this commission said, we don't have the authority to do anything, but after investigating, there was so much violence and shenanigans on Election Day, though that popular vote should be thrown out of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina. We're confident that if it had been a free and fair election, the black population alone, the freedmen, let alone the carpetbaggers and scalawags, should have thrown this election to Hayes. He should win. Now, again, they had no authority to do it, but they could. Federal government is basically putting its stamp on the fact that Hayes should win. It's kind of hard to overturn that. Yet still, the machinery of government was deadlocked. And so literally 2 days before inauguration, on March 2nd, a deal was made in a hotel room in Washington, D.C., where basically Democrats said, all right, basically the federal government investigated and claims that Hayes won. We think this is a theft. I will concede. I will tell my followers to stand down, to not use violence, and to accept Hayes as president. But you're going to have to pull the troops out of the South. Now, there weren't many left. There were probably only about 5,000 soldiers throughout the entire South. But they were propping up the Republican governments of Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Hayes would be inaugurated 2 days later. And he would, right after inauguration, go to a little telegraph office and send a message for all the boys to come home, effectively ending Reconstruction and the Civil War, and just saying, let the South kind of run its own affairs. The Republican governors there begged the troops to stay, but they couldn't. And those Republican governors are basically threatened. Their residences are surrounded by these angry white mobs, and they're told to get out of town or they will be killed. And so effectively, those governments are overthrown illegally, and democratic redemption governments come in. What effectively happened with the election of 1877 is the Republican Party held on to power, but the Democrats were able to leverage the end of Reconstruction. After this, Reconstruction's effectively over. It doesn't matter that we've got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Southern states effectively, without the Union Army there, could basically pass all of these awful segregation and Jim Crow laws that would take control until the 1950s and 60s. So until the Civil Rights Movement comes around, we have a society that's very unequal and sort of an apartheid government in the South. And that's the origins of it. There was this sort of brief glimmer of hope. Reconstruction was this hopeful period where we might have this beautiful biracial democracy, black and white people living together, forming political parties, reaching across the aisle in brotherhood. It wasn't to be, at least not yet. It'll be delayed another 80 years or so. But in the 50s and 60s, we'll do Reconstruction over again and do it right. Okay, kind of long-winded, but I love Reconstruction, and as hopefully it shows, fascinating time period. Wish we had done it right, but it was doomed to failure, and it did fail in the long term. But the groundwork was laid to do it again right in another 80 years. All right, folks, that's the end of Unit 3. We'll start doing some fun activities. We'll look at documents next time and do on that, right? All right. I will see you guys later. Have a good one. Bye-bye.